You ever wonder how two different scientists can look at the exact same data and yet come to completely opposite conclusions? Well, today we're diving into a fascinating study from Science Advances that unpacks exactly how a researcher's personal ideology can actually shape their scientific findings. This really is the central puzzle, isn't it? You give a bunch of research teams the same data, ask them to answer the same question, and still, the results can be all over the map. So this study really sets out to understand why that happens. You know, researchers often call the whole analytical process a black box. Raw data goes in one side and out comes a finding on the other. But inside that box, countless small decisions get made along the way. And it's in there that bias can quietly creep in. What's so cool about this study is its design. It basically pries open that box so we can all see what's really happening inside. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll unpack this black box problem. Then, we'll look at the study's really clever design. After that, we are going to get into the key findings, explore how this ideological impact happens, and then wrap up by talking about the bigger implications. So first up, let's really get into this whole black box problem in research. Look, having some variation in research findings is pretty normal, but trying to prove that this variation comes from a researcher's personal beliefs, that's incredibly hard to do, mainly because the research process usually happens behind closed doors. You just can't observe it like a controlled experiment. And that brings us to our second section, and really what makes this paper so powerful, its unique experimental design. So check out the brilliant way they set this up. Step 1, they gave 71 independent research teams one single data set and one simple question. Does immigration affect public support for social welfare? Step 2, and this is the really crucial part, they surveyed the researchers beforehand to figure out their personal ideological stance on immigration. And then finally, step 3, the teams went to work and produced over 1,200 different analytical models, which created this massive pool of results to analyze. Now, take a look at the baseline data here. Before a single calculation was made, the study mapped out the ideological landscape of the participants. And what's really striking is that over half of the researchers already held pro-immigration views. A much smaller group, less than 8%, held anti-immigration views. This pre-analysis data is the key to unlocking everything that comes next. All right, so with that baseline set, let's move on to section 3 and see what they found. This is where we get to see the direct impact of ideology on the results. This image is just so powerful. It plots out the distribution of all the findings. They're measured as the average marginal effect, or AME. Just think of it as a way to measure the impact of immigration in this study. Now just look at panel C. The red curve, that's the teams with anti-immigration views, is clearly shifted to the left, toward negative findings. And the blue curve, for the pro-immigration teams, is shifted to the right, toward positive ones. The split is, well, it's unmistakable. And the raw numbers confirm exactly what that graph suggests. On average, the anti-immigration teams came up with a negative result, a negative 0.057. But the pro-immigration teams, they produced a positive average result of plus 0.027. And what's more, the anti-immigration teams were way more likely to find a statistically significant negative effect, while the pro-immigration teams were much less likely to. So the number you really need to remember is this one, 0.085. That is the total statistically significant difference in the average finding between the pro and anti-immigration teams. And to put that number into context for you, an effect that size is substantial. It's actually large enough to take a research finding from the bottom 16th percentile of all the results and launch it all the way up to the 63rd percentile. So this is not some minor variation we're talking about. It is a major, major shift. Okay, so that leads to the next big question, which is, section 4, how on earth does this happen? Well, the study points to something called endogenous research design. Let's break that down. Endogenous research design just means that a researcher's choices about how to analyze the data, their methodology, those choices aren't just neutral. They are actually shaped by the researcher's own background and beliefs, including their ideology. And this chart illustrates that process perfectly. See those gray bars at the bottom? They represent different combinations of analytical choices. As you can see, those choices lead to very different expected outcomes, which are plotted up above. The key thing to notice here is that teams with anti-immigration views were the only ones to pick model combinations that produced the most negative expected results. Meanwhile, the pro-immigration teams were the only ones to pick combinations that led to the most positive. The study actually found that about 2/3 of this ideological effect could be explained by combinations of just 5 key methodological decisions. We're talking about things like how to measure immigration, which statistical models to use, and which data sets to include. It wasn't one single choice that did it, but the combination of them. So, what about the quality of the research itself? Well, in a blind peer review, the designs from the moderate teams, the ones in the middle, actually got the highest quality scores. But both the strongly pro and anti-immigration teams, the ones who chose the paths that led to more extreme results, had their designs rated as lower quality. This kind of suggests that leaning too far in one ideological direction might just correlate with making less robust research choices. Okay, finally, let's get to Section 5, the study's implications and, just as important, its limitations. The authors are really upfront about the study's constraints. It wasn't originally designed to test for ideology, for one. Also, the number of anti-immigration teams was pretty small, and it's always possible that researchers weren't 100% candid in the ideology survey. And maybe most importantly, we still don't know the exact cognitive process, like is it conscious or unconscious, that leads to these biased choices. This really gets to a broader concern, one the authors highlight themselves. So much of today's research is meant to inform policy, and they warn that this focus could actually amplify the role of ideological bias because researchers might be more personally invested in the outcomes. So, after all of that, what's the big take-home message? It's actually very clear and direct. A researcher's own ideology can be a powerful force that shapes their analytical choices, which in turn determines their final scientific conclusions. That black box is definitely not neutral. And that leaves us with a final, really important question. Knowing that even rigorous science can be shaped by human bias, how should we all approach new research, especially when it's about a politically charged topic? It's a critical question for all of us to think about.